The woman who stepped off the westbound stage in Caldwell, Kansas on a blistering afternoon in June of 1878 was not who her travel papers said she was, and she carried that secret like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat, heavy and constant against her ribs. She called herself Kate Donnelly, had been calling herself that for 2 years, and by now the name fit her mouth the way a well-worn boot fits a foot, not quite natural, never quite perfect, but functional enough to keep her moving forward. The real Kate Donnelly had been her sister, younger by 3 years, dead of fever outside of St. Louis before she reached her 14th birthday. The woman standing in the Kansas dust now had been born Nora Feeney, daughter of a man whose name she refused to think about, a man who had sold her into a life she had clawed her way free of with nothing but her wits and the ghost of her dead sister's identity folded into her pocket. Caldwell in 1878 was no gentle place. It sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, breathing cattle and leather, and the particular desperation of men who had ridden too long under an open sky. The saloons ran day and night. The jail was full more often than not. A woman arriving alone with a single carpetbag and a set expression was either very brave or very stupid, and most men who watched Kate Donnelly step onto the boardwalk that afternoon assumed the latter. She assumed nothing about them at all. She had learned years ago that assumptions were a luxury that people in her position could not afford. The letter in her coat pocket folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft as cloth, had come through a women's placement agency out of Wichita. She had answered their advertisement seeking capable women, willing to work as housekeepers or cooks for respectable ranching families in the surrounding territory. The agency had matched her with a man named George Atkins, a widower with 300 head of cattle and a ranch called the AA outside of town. The letter had promised fair wages, a private room, and no improper expectations. She had read that last line 4 times before she believed it enough to board the stage. What the letter had not mentioned was George Atkins's son. She found the ranch office on the main street of Caldwell, a squat building next to the land registrar, and pushed inside out of the glare. An older man with silver-streaked hair and hands like saddle leather looked up from behind a desk cluttered with ledger books and cattle receipts. He had kind eyes, the sort that had seen hard things and chosen softness anyway, and Kate felt some tight coil in her chest relax by a single degree. "You'd be the woman from the agency," George Atkins said, rising from his chair with the careful courtesy of a man raised to stand for women, whatever the circumstances. "I'm George. We expected you on yesterday's stage." "There was a delay at the river crossing," Kate said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady now. She had practiced that the way other women practice piano. "I'm Kate Donnelly." George shook her hand with both of his, which she hadn't expected, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Miss Donnelly. I'll have someone bring water. The heat today is something ungodly." She sat. She answered his questions. Did she know how to cook for working men? Yes. Could she manage a household inventory? Yes. Was she comfortable around horses? Reasonably so. And she watched him decide she was trustworthy with the particular efficiency of a man who read people for a living the way other men read newspapers. The door opened behind her before she had finished her second glass of water. She heard the boots first. A particular sound, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of someone who owned the ground they crossed, and then a voice that carried without effort, the way certain voices do, filling a room not with volume but with presence. "Pa, Hector says the fence line on the north pasture is broken again. We're going to lose the Callaway herd into the creek if we don't." The voice stopped. Kate turned in her chair. He was perhaps 26, tall in the lean, angular way of men who spent their days in the saddle, with dark hair pushed back under a battered brown hat, and eyes the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and clear and startlingly direct. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the land outside, and there was dust on his clothes from the collar to the boots, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, which was unusual, because she had spent 2 years learning to categorize men's expressions in under 3 seconds as a matter of survival. This one had none of the hunger she was accustomed to reading, none of the cold appraisal, none of the dismissal. He looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected, not threatened, not aggressive, simply surprised and then, almost immediately, curious. "Clayton," George said with the mild patience of a father, "this is Miss Kate Donnelly, come from the agency in Wichita. She'll be managing the house." Clayton Atkins, she had his name now, fitted it around the tall shape of him, pulled his hat from his head and held it against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, "welcome to Caldwell." "Thank you," Kate said. He nodded once, looked at his father. "I'll get the fence crew together, just wanted to let you know." "Go on then," George said. Clayton went. The door closed behind him with the same unhurried certainty as his boots had announced him, and Kate turned back to find George watching her with a small, knowing expression that she chose to ignore completely. The AA ranch house was 3 miles outside of town, sitting on a slight rise above a creek bend with cottonwood trees that threw long shade in the evenings. The house itself was large by frontier standards. 2 stories of plain timber construction, a wide covered porch, a kitchen that had been built with genuine care, and 6 bedrooms, of which she was given the one at the end of the hall with a window that looked out over the east pasture. It was the best private room she had slept in since she was a child, small enough that private rooms had seemed unremarkable. She stood at that window on her first night and looked out over the dark land and let herself feel the particular fragile thing that she had not felt in 2 years, something that bordered on hope. There were 5 hands who ate at the long kitchen table 3 times a day, plus George and Clayton. She cooked for them starting before sunup, and she did it with the focused competence that had always been her best shield. Work hard enough, and people ask fewer questions, because there is nothing to question about a woman who does her job without complaint and does it well. The hands were respectful enough. 2 of them, a pair of brothers named Eli and Thomas Marsh, were genuinely decent. They cleared their own dishes and said please and thank you with what appeared to be actual sincerity. The others were ordinary men in the ordinary sense, not cruel but not particularly thoughtful, absorbed in the daily exhaustions of cattle work and indifferent to the domestic machinery that kept them fed. Clayton was different from all of them. She noticed it gradually, the way you notice a particular quality of light, not as a single revelation but as an accumulation of small observations that eventually form something you cannot ignore. He noticed things. Not in the unsettling way some men notice things about women, cataloging, measuring, but in the way a person notices details because they are genuinely paying attention to the world around them. He noticed when the water in the kitchen barrel ran low, and he refilled it without being asked. He noticed when the older ranch dog, a gray-muzzled hound named Pepper, was limping, and he stayed up late one night cleaning and wrapping the animal's paw with the same focused care he gave to everything. He noticed, on her 3rd morning, that Kate had eaten standing at the kitchen counter while everyone else sat at the table, and he said nothing about it directly. But the following morning, when she set the food out and turned around, he had pulled a chair from the corner and placed it at the end of the table with a 2nd cup and a 2nd plate, positioned with deliberate normalcy as if it had always been there, as if she had always had a place. She sat down and ate with the rest of them and didn't say a word about it, and he didn't either, and that was somehow more eloquent than any statement either of them could have made. He rode out before dawn most mornings and came back with the last of the light, and she grew accustomed to the sound of his horse in the yard the way you grow accustomed to the sound of a clock, present enough to notice its absence if it was gone. He never sought her out particularly. He wasn't the kind of man who manufactured reasons to be near a woman he found interesting. She would learn this about him, that his interest expressed itself not in pursuit but in quality of attention, the particular completeness with which he listened when she spoke, as if what she said mattered and he intended to treat it accordingly. The conversation that started everything important between them happened on a Thursday evening in early July, 6 weeks after she arrived. She was on the porch shelling beans in the long blue dusk, and he came up from the barn with his hat in his hand and stopped at the porch steps and said, without preamble, "Miss Donnelly, do you know anything about stars?" She looked up. He was leaning one shoulder against the porch post, looking not at her but out over the darkening eastern sky where the first stars were beginning to assert themselves. "Some," she said carefully. She always said things carefully. "My mother used to name them," he said. "All the wrong names, I think, just ones she made up. She said the real names were too hard to remember and the stars didn't care anyway." He paused. "She died 4 years ago. I still catch myself looking up there expecting her to point something out." Kate set her bowl of beans down in her lap and looked at the sky. Something in her chest moved, not the dangerous, soft movement of sympathy that she had spent years suppressing because it cost too much, but something more considered than that. Something chosen. "My sister used to do the same thing," she said. "With clouds. She gave them all names and little histories. Said every cloud was somebody from somewhere trying to get somewhere else." She had not spoken of her sister to anyone in 2 years. The words came out quiet and steady and felt, surprisingly, like putting down something she had been carrying for a very long time. Clayton looked at her then. Not the brief, glancing look of ordinary conversation, but the full, patient attention she had begun to recognize as his particular way of engaging with things that mattered to him. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your sister." "She was very young," Kate said. "It was a fever." "These things happen." "They do," he agreed, with none of the false comfort that people usually layered over that kind of statement, just the plain acknowledgement of it, which was better. They sat in silence for a while, the two of them, while the stars came out in their dozens and then their hundreds over the Kansas plain, and Kate shelled beans and Clayton didn't leave, and neither of them found it necessary to fill the quiet with noise. It was the first evening she felt, genuinely and specifically, that she was in the presence of someone who might be worth trusting. That thought terrified her completely. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. She recognized the handwriting before she had fully drawn the envelope from the saddlebag of the Caldwell Post rider. A cramped, left-handed scrawl she had spent 3 years trying to forget. It was addressed to Kate Donnelly at the AA Ranch outside Caldwell, Kansas, and that was wrong in a way that made her throat tighten to near closing, because only one person in the world knew she had taken her dead sister's name, and that person should not have known where she was. His name was Victor Malone. He ran a gambling house and a number of less mentionable operations out of Joplin, Missouri, and Kate Norafini, as she had been then, had worked for him for 18 months under circumstances that she had never chosen and could not have refused. She had escaped from Joplin in November of 1876, taking nothing but the clothes she wore and the knowledge of her sister's name, and the desperate, absolute conviction that she would rather die on an open road than spend another year in that place. She had worked her way west through a series of increasingly legitimate positions: a laundry in Springfield, a boarding house kitchen in Fort Scott, the placement agency in Wichita, and she had covered her trail as carefully as she knew how, which had apparently not been careful enough. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove without opening it, but she did not sleep that night or the next. She told herself it could be coincidence, a guess, a shot in the dark that happened to land. She told herself that Joplin was far away, and Victor Malone had no particular reason to come to Kansas in person over a woman who had never been anything to him but one of many. She told herself these things and did not believe a single one of them, because she knew Victor Malone, knew the specific quality of his pride, the way he kept ledgers not only of money but of what he considered debts, and she had left without paying what he believed she owed him. She began to plan quietly, without any indication visible to anyone around her. She had enough wages saved for a stage ticket to Colorado. She knew there was work in Denver. She could be gone within the week, cleanly, without explanation, the way she had left every other place, leaving behind nothing but a tidy room and a small gap in the household routine that would close over after a few days the way water closes over a stone. It was a good plan. It was the plan she had used before, and it had kept her alive and free. She was going to execute it on a Saturday morning, when George rode into town for his weekly meeting with the cattle broker, and Clayton took the hands out to the south pasture for fence work, and the house would be quiet enough to pack in peace. She was in her room folding her second dress into the carpetbag when she heard the hoofbeats in the yard. Not returning hands, too few horses, too fast, the wrong time of day. She crossed to her window with the particular unhurried caution she had developed for emergency situations and looked down into the yard and saw a man she did not know dismounting from a gray horse, and behind him, hanging back at the edge of the yard, a second man she did not know. They were not dressed like cowboys. They were dressed like men who worked indoors and wanted people to know they carried authority. Her hands went still on the carpetbag strap. Malone's men did not usually look like cowboys either. She was down the stairs and out the back door before they knocked on the front, moving through the kitchen garden and around the corner of the barn with the carpetbag over her shoulder. She reached the far side of the barn and stopped, thinking hard, because the corral horses were on the wrong side of the barn and the road into town was in front of the house where those men were, and the south pasture fence crew was 2 miles away. "Miss Donnelly," Clayton's voice, from around the corner of the barn. She stopped so fast she nearly fell. He stepped around the corner of the barn on foot, holding a fence post mallet in one hand, his hat back on his head where it belonged, dust from the morning's work on his clothes. He had apparently come back for something, a tool, she guessed, from the supply shed, and he had seen the men in the yard. He looked at her face, at the carpetbag over her shoulder, at the direction she had come from, and made a very fast and apparently very accurate calculation. "You know those men?" He said, quiet and even. "No," she said, which was precisely the wrong word but came out before she could stop it. He looked at her for one long, still moment. "You're afraid of them," he said, not a question. She said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. He set the fence post mallet down against the barn wall, slowly and deliberately. "How much time do you need?" She stared at him. "What?" "If you need to leave," he said, still in that same quiet, level voice, as if this were the most ordinary conversation imaginable. "How much time do you need to get clear of the road before they'd catch up?" Something cracked inside her chest. Not broke, cracked, the way ice cracks in spring, the sound of something rigid beginning to give way. "I don't understand why you would." "Miss Donnelly," he said patiently, "I'm going to go around the front of this barn and ask those men what their business is, and that is going to take some number of minutes. What I need to know is whether those minutes are enough for you, or whether I need to be significantly less cooperative about it." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, steady, asking nothing, except the practical information required to be useful. "The North Road," she said. "If I take the North Road and cut across the creek bed, I can get to the Marsh Brothers' place and from there into town." "The creek bed runs shallow this time of year," he said. "You won't lose time in it. Go." She went. She made it to town. She sat in the back of the hardware store for 3 hours where Thomas Marsh's wife, a sturdy woman named Helen who did not ask questions that weren't her business, gave her tea and a chair and a corner to sit in while she thought. Clayton Atkins rode into town mid-afternoon. He tied his horse at the rail outside the hardware store and walked in and found her behind the bolt cloth display, still holding a cold cup of tea, and he pulled a stool from behind the counter and sat down across from her without any preamble or performance. "They were from a county sheriff's office in Missouri," he said. "Joplin, they said, serving papers on a woman named Kate Donnelly in connection with some business matter." He paused. "They said Kate Donnelly had worked in Joplin for a man named Victor Malone." She kept her eyes on the cold tea in her cup. "The woman they described," Clayton said carefully, "sounded like you." Silence settled between them, thick as August heat. "Is your name Kate Donnelly?" he asked. It was the most direct question anyone had ever asked her about the most dangerous truth she held, and he asked it quietly, without accusation, without the loaded weight of judgment behind it. Simply asked, the way a man asks a question he genuinely wants the answer to and is prepared to hear. She set the cup down. "No," she said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a long moment. A wagon went by outside on the main street and someone called out to someone else, and the ordinary sounds of Caldwell in the afternoon continued entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing happening in the back of the hardware store. "Do you want to tell me?" he said. "Not particularly," she said. Then, because honesty, once begun, has a momentum of its own. "But I think I'm going to anyway," she told him. Not all of it, not every detail of the 18 months she had spent in Joplin, because those details were hers, and she was not yet capable of giving them to anyone, but the essential shape of it. That her real name was Nora Feeney, that she had worked for Victor Malone under circumstances that left her no choice at the time, and that she had chosen, 2 years ago, to leave those circumstances behind and start again with her dead sister's name and nothing else. That she had placed herself through the agency in Wichita and come to the AA with the honest intention of doing honest work, and she had done exactly that, and she was asking for nothing from him except perhaps the direction of the nearest stage line out of Kansas. Clayton listened. He listened the way he did everything completely, patiently, without interruption, without the flinching or the hardening that she had expected and braced for. He listened until she was finished, and then he was quiet for a long enough moment that she began to gather herself for the particular mechanical composure she would need to stand up and walk out of this town carrying the wreckage of yet another identity. "Those papers they were serving," he said at last. "What kind of business matter? Malone would claim I owe him money for the accommodation he provided while I worked for him." Her voice was flat. She had learned to keep it flat when she talked about Malone. "That is how he keeps people. He makes them owe him more than they can pay back. He calls it debt. Other words for it exist." Clayton's jaw tightened, just once briefly. Then it smoothed out again. "Those men are gone," he said. "I told them the Kate Donnelly they were looking for had left 2 weeks ago, headed for Colorado. One of the hands back at the ranch, Eli, confirmed it without me even asking him to, which suggests Eli is paying more attention than I give him credit for. A beat. They believed it. They rode back south." She stared at him. "You lied for me," she said. "You didn't know why. You didn't know what I'd done or who I was, and you lied for me." "I knew you were afraid," he said simply. "I knew those men scared you. That was enough." She had been through a great many things in her 23 years on this earth, and she had thought by now that she had a reasonably accurate map of what people were capable of, both at their worst and at their best. Clayton Atkins had just walked entirely off the edges of that map. "I don't know what to do with that," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in 2 years. The corners of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, too careful for that, but it was something adjacent to one. "You don't have to do anything with it today," he said. "Come back to the ranch. You still have a job if you want it." "Your father," she said. "He'll need to know." "I'll talk to my father. And my name, I'll call you Kate," he said. "It was your sister's name. There's nothing wrong with carrying it for her." She looked at him for a long, silent moment, this tall, dusty, plain-spoken man sitting on a hardware store stool with creek-water eyes and a quality of steadiness that she had never encountered in another human being before and was entirely unprepared for. "Why?" she asked. The word came out smaller than she intended. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor between his boots, and then he looked up at her with an expression she could not quite name, not quite vulnerable, not quite certain, but somewhere in the honest country between those two territories. "Because whatever happened to you before you got to the AA," he said slowly, "it wasn't your fault. And because you make the best coffee west of Wichita, and I'd hate to lose you over a Missouri paperwork problem." He paused. "And because I haven't stopped thinking about the way you talked about your sister on the porch that evening. And I'd like to know more about you, Kate, if you're willing. Your real name, your real stories, all of it. I'd like to know who you actually are." She had to look away from him because looking at him directly when he said things like that was more than she could currently manage. "I might have to leave," she said, "if Malone sends more men, if he doesn't believe the Colorado story." "We'll handle it," he said, "together if you'll let me." "Why would you take that on?" "Because," he said, and there was a quiet, certain warmth in his voice now that she felt across the 6 feet of distance between them. "Some things are worth taking on." George Atkins took the news with the grave, considered silence of a man who has lived long enough to understand that people's histories are rarely tidy. He sat across from Kate at the kitchen table that evening with his hands folded and his kind eyes steady, and when she finished speaking the real story, the real name, all of it, he was quiet for a long moment. "I knew a man in St. Louis once," he said at last, "who hired a man under a false name to escape a gambling debt. That man turned out to be the best ranch foreman I ever saw in my life. The name didn't make him who he was. His work did." He looked at her. "Your work has been good, Kate. Whatever name you carry, you're welcome here." She thanked him. She meant it absolutely. Eli Marsh came to her the following morning while she was at the stove and said, quietly, without fanfare, that he and Thomas had noticed something was off about those Missouri men, and that if she ever needed word carried somewhere fast, his brother had a horse that could outrun anything south of the Cimarron River. She thanked him too, and he nodded once and went back to his breakfast, and that was all that was said about it. The weeks that followed were the strangest she had lived in 2 years, not because they were dangerous, but because they were not. She woke each morning in the same room with the east pasture window, and she did the same work she had always done, but something had shifted in the quality of the days, some internal pressure she had lived inside so long she had forgotten to notice it. It was gone, or going, slowly and imperfectly the way things go when they've been present for a very long time, but going nonetheless. She and Clayton talked in the evenings. Not always. Some evenings he was too tired and some evenings she was, and the ranch had its rhythms that didn't always leave room for conversation, but often enough that it became a pattern she began to expect and then, cautiously, to look forward to. He told her about the ranch, about his childhood here, about his mother who had named the stars wrong and laughed about it. He told her about the Kishom Trail and the summer he had ridden with a cattle drive at 17, and the specific loneliness of sleeping under open sky for 3 months with 20 other men, and still feeling entirely alone. He told her about the land, the way he felt about it, with a plain directness that she found unexpectedly moving, not poetic exactly, but precise, the way someone talks about something they genuinely love and have thought about for a long time. She told him things too. Slowly, not all at once, but she told him about her childhood in St. Louis before her father had made it necessary to leave, about her sister Kate, the real Kate, small and bright-eyed and unafraid of anything, who had made every hard thing bearable while she lived, about the agency in Wichita and the woman there who had looked at her travel-worn, half-starved self and found her a position without asking more questions than necessary. She didn't tell him everything. Not yet. The Joplin months remained hers, locked and private, and he didn't push for them, which was one of the more significant things about him she catalogued during those weeks. What she did notice, and tried not to think about too directly, was that she had stopped planning her escape. She noticed it one evening in late August when she caught herself calculating the cost of winter fabric to replace the kitchen curtains, which was not the calculation of a woman who intended to be gone by the first frost. She set the thought aside with some alarm, and then, later that night, took it out again and looked at it honestly. She was not planning to leave. The realization arrived with both warmth and terror in equal measure. She was making a home here, or the beginnings of one. She was putting down roots she had spent 2 years refusing to put down anywhere, and she was doing it on soil that belonged to George Atkins, and that was tended by his son. And she was doing it not because she had run out of road, but because some part of her, the part that remembered sitting on a porch shelling beans in the blue dusk, while a man talked about his mother and the stars, had decided this was a place worth stopping for. The first time Clayton Atkins almost kissed her was in September during a rainstorm. He had ridden in late, after dark, soaking wet from a sudden prairie storm that had come up from the south with no warning, the way Kansas weather did. She had heard the horse in the yard, and without particularly thinking about it, had put a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and cut a slab of the cornbread left from supper. He came in through the back door, dripping onto the kitchen floor with his hat in his hand, and she turned from the stove with the coffee and found him closer than she had expected, because the kitchen was dark except for the stove fire, and she had not heard him come all the way to the counter. They were perhaps 2 feet apart in the fire-lit kitchen, the rain loud on the roof above them, and he was looking at her in a way that was entirely different from the steady, patient, considerate way he usually looked at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he wants deeply and has been trying to be disciplined about, and she felt it through her whole body like a chord struck on a piano, resonant, unmistakable, affecting more than just the place it originated. "Coffee," she said. Her voice came out exactly steady. She had no idea how. He blinked. The expression shifted back to something more controlled, and he took the cup she held out to him with both hands because his hands were cold, she guessed, from the rain. "Thank you," he said. They stood in the kitchen while he drank the coffee and she ate a corner of the cornbread, and neither of them said anything, and the rain came down, and she was aware of his physical presence with a specificity she had been trying to avoid being aware of for several weeks. "Kate," he said when the cup was about half empty. "Clayton," she said carefully. He looked at his coffee cup. "I want you to know something. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm aware that you came here in a professional capacity, and that whatever's developed between us over these weeks, conversations, I mean, and the evening talking, I want you to know that I don't have any expectations from that. I'm not trying to put you in a position." She looked at him. The firelight made angles of his face, the jaw, the cheekbones, the careful set of his mouth. "And if I had expectations," she said. He looked up sharply. The coffee cup was very still in his hands. "Of what sort?" he asked, and his voice had gone careful and warm at once, which was a combination she had only ever heard from him. She didn't answer immediately. She thought about it honestly, which she had been trying not to do, and she looked at what she found when she thought about it honestly, and she found something that surprised her with its clarity and its size. "Of the sort," she said slowly, "where I'm not planning to leave at first frost anymore." The silence in the kitchen was different from ordinary silences. He set the coffee cup down on the counter. He crossed the 2 feet of kitchen floor between them slowly and with intention, and he put one hand, still slightly cold from the rain. She felt it through her sleeve against her arm just below the shoulder, a light, questioning contact that said clearly, "Is this acceptable? Are you certain? I am asking." She looked up at him and found his face very close and his expression very earnest and very careful and entirely without manipulation, and she put her hand against his chest. She could feel his heart under her palm, beating faster than his surface composure suggested, and that was her answer. He kissed her once gently with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything, and then he stepped back, and they both stood there in the rain-loud kitchen with the fire going, and she felt something in her chest settle into a place it had never occupied before. "I would very much like," he said quietly, "to court you properly, if that's something you'd want." "It is," she said. "Provided we're clear that I have opinions and I intend to express them." The full smile appeared then, not careful or restrained, the real one, and it rearranged his face entirely into something almost boyish, and she thought privately that this was a catastrophically dangerous thing to discover about a person, that their real smile could do that to a room. "I would be very disappointed if you didn't," he said. The courting, as Clayton called it with old-fashioned sincerity, proceeded through the fall of 1878, with a sweetness and a steadiness that Kate had no prior framework for, and therefore kept examining from different angles to make sure it was real. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank when he happened past them, not as a romantic gesture exactly, but more as a notice. I saw this and thought of you, which she found more affecting than any practiced romance. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons on a quiet bay mare named Clara, who had a smooth gait and an affectionate nature, and they rode the land together, and he showed her the places that meant something to him. The rise where you could see 20 miles of Kansas in every direction on a clear day, the place where the creek bent double and the cottonwoods grew so close together their branches laced overhead like a green ceiling. The fence post his mother had carved her initials into 20 years ago and that he had never painted over. She told him things too, on those rides, more than she had told anyone. She told him about the real Kate, her sister, the small, bright-eyed girl who had been afraid of nothing and who had been taken by fever before she had a chance to be afraid of anything. She told him that she had chosen the name not only as a practical disguise, but as a kind of tribute, a way of letting her sister be alive in the world a little longer. And when she said this, Clayton was quiet for a long time, and then he said that he thought her sister would have approved, which made her eyes sting in a way she refused to apologize for. She told him about her father eventually, not in detail but in enough outline that he understood the shape of it. A man who should have protected his daughters and had instead been the thing they needed protecting from. Clayton's jaw went tight when she told him this, and then, with visible effort, he let it go, because she was clearly not telling him so that he would react to it but so that he would know it, and he understood the difference. "You don't have to carry any of that anymore," he said, when she was finished with the essential shape of it. "I'm not saying forget it. I don't think you can and I don't think you should. It made you who you are. But you don't have to carry it alone." "I'm not accustomed to not carrying things alone," she said. "I know," he said. "I've noticed. I'm hoping you'll let me help you get accustomed to it." She looked at him, sitting his horse in the autumn light with the Kansas plain rolling out behind him in shades of gold and amber, and she thought that she had spent so long running that she had entirely forgotten what it felt like to arrive somewhere. "I think," she said, "I might already be getting used to it." November brought cold and wind, and the last of the cattle drives down from the north, and with it came a rider from Joplin. Kate saw him before he reached the ranch, from her east pasture window in the early morning, a man on a dark horse coming up the north road at a deliberate pace, wearing the kind of clothes that meant business. Her stomach went cold and still. She went downstairs. Clayton was already in the kitchen, finishing his coffee before the morning ride, and she told him quietly and without hysteria that there was a man coming up the road from the north that she was fairly certain had come from Victor Malone. Clayton set down his coffee cup. "What does he want?" he asked. He was very calm. "Malone believes I took money from him when I left," she said. "I didn't." "But he believes it, or he claims to believe it, which amounts to the same thing in terms of what he'll send people to do about it." "How much does he claim?" She told him the number. It was substantial by any measure, and she had lived with the shame of it, not of owing it because she didn't, but of being the kind of person who could be accused of it for 2 years. Clayton nodded once. "Stay inside," he said. "Clayton, Kate," he said. He said her name, the name she had chosen, the name that was hers now by a different kind of inheritance than birth, with a quiet firmness. "Stay inside. I'll handle this." She stayed inside, but she stood at the front window where she could see the yard, and she watched. The man from Malone dismounted at the gate, and Clayton met him there, and they spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. She could not hear the conversation, but she could read it in the body language. The other man's posture starting aggressive and becoming uncertain, Clayton's remaining steady throughout, never threatening, never raising in volume, simply unmovable. She had seen that quality of immovable steadiness in him before, over small things, but seeing it deployed over something this large made her throat tight. She saw money change hands, Clayton's money, from his coat pocket. Not a great amount, but enough, apparently, because the man from Malone looked at it and then looked at Clayton and then remounted his horse and rode away back down the north road without coming any closer to the house. She met Clayton at the front door. "What did you do?" she asked. "Settled a debt," he said. It wasn't my debt. It's settled regardless. He looked at her calmly. Malone's man will go back and report that the matter is resolved. Malone is a businessman. He wanted money, not specifically you. Now he has a portion of what he claims he's owed, and the rest was negotiated down on account of. He paused, and something flickered at the corner of his mouth. I may have implied that you had very powerful friends in Kansas who would find it inconvenient if this situation continued. She stared at him. Do I have powerful friends in Kansas? You have my father, he said, who knows every cattle broker between here and Wichita and has a very respectable temper when it's roused. And you have the Marsh brothers, who between them could stop a small army. And you have Eli's horse that outran a Comanche raiding party in 1874. Whether that constitutes powerful is perhaps a matter of interpretation. She looked at him for a long, wordless moment. I cannot allow you to pay that, she said. You can't unallow it. It's already paid. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door and turned back to her. Kate, I need to ask you something. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself in the particular way she had come to recognize, not hesitation, but the careful preparation of someone who intends to say something important precisely. I am not a man who does things by halves, he said. I don't pay off debts for women I intend to part ways with. I don't spend Sunday afternoons riding the land with someone I haven't thought about keeping around permanently. He looked at her steadily. I want to marry you. I want to marry you, and I want to do it with your real name, and I want it to be a real thing that we choose together, not an escape for you and not a rescue either. Just two people who have found each other in a fairly unlikely set of circumstances and who have enough good sense to do something about it. The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved along the eaves. My real name, she said slowly. Nora Feeney Atkins, he said, if you want it. I've been Kate for 2 years, she said. I've become Kate. I can't entirely go back to Nora. Then be Kate Atkins, he said simply. Your sister gave you the name, it's yours. I'm just offering something to put behind it. She stood in the front hallway of the AA Ranch house and looked at this man 26 years old, dusty from the morning's preparations, with creekwater eyes and a steady jaw and hands that had just now paid a crooked Missouri businessman's fraudulent debt without a moment's self-congratulation. And she felt something move inside her with the force and finality of something that had been held in place for a very long time by tremendous effort, and had now simply, completely, let go. Yes, she said, I want to marry you. He crossed the hallway and put both his hands against her face and kissed her with the full, genuine warmth that he usually kept calibrated and contained. And she held onto his coat with both fists and kissed him back. And there, in the cold November hallway with the wind outside, something that had been broken for a very long time began, with some difficulty and great sincerity, to knit itself back together. They were married on the 22nd of December, 1878, in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, by a minister with a white beard and an appropriately solemn expression who mispronounced Clayton's name once, and then corrected himself with good humor. George Atkins sat in the front pew and wept openly, which he appeared entirely unbothered about. The Marsh brothers were there in their good shirts, and Helen Marsh cried too, and several of the other hands came in their cleanest clothes and stood at the back with their hats in their hands. Kate Donnelly, she had filed the legal paperwork the week before, completing the change she had begun 2 years ago on a road outside St. Louis, making the name officially hers by law as it had been by choice, wore a dress of deep blue wool that Helen Marsh had helped her sew over 3 evenings, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers because nothing was blooming in December in Kansas, and she walked up the aisle of the Caldwell Presbyterian Church toward Clayton Atkins with her chin up and her hands steady. He was waiting at the altar in his best coat, which was still dusty at the cuffs despite evident effort, and when she reached him he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months, completely, steadily, as if there was nothing else in the room worth looking at, and he held out his hand and she put her hand in his. You look beautiful, he said quietly, in the moment before the minister began, just for her. "You have dust on your cuffs," she said, equally quietly. "There is always going to be dust on my cuffs," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't mind." The vows were plain and brief, and she meant every word of them with a sincerity that surprised even her, which was perhaps the most telling thing about the whole proceeding. She was not a woman who had expected to mean her wedding vows. She had not truthfully expected to be standing in this church saying wedding vows to this particular man, but here she was, and the word yes came out of her with the weight of a real decision fully made, which is the only way a yes worth anything ever comes out of anyone. They rode back to the AA in the wagon through the December cold, under a sky that was sharp and bright as cut glass, and George had organized something that approached a celebration the other ranching families from the surrounding territory. A fiddler hired from one of the saloons, more food than the kitchen table could comfortably hold. Kate danced twice with Clayton, once slowly and once to a reel that left her breathless and laughing, actually laughing, which felt strange and good in her face, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use and was now remembering. And once with George, who danced with the careful dignity of a man who had once been very good at it and still remembered the steps. Late in the evening, when the celebration had thinned to the last few stragglers, she stood on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders and looked out at the winter dark over the east pasture. Clayton came out behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin against the top of her head, and they stood there in the cold together. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I don't know how to be happy without looking for what's going to ruin it." "That's reasonable," he said. "It'll take some practice." "I haven't had much practice." "We have time," he said. "I intend to give you a great deal of practice." She leaned back against him and looked up at the winter stars over the Kansas plain, and she thought about her sister, the real Kate, who had named clouds and given them little histories. And she thought about the name she carried and what it had cost and what it had given her, and what it had, in some strange and unintended way, led her to. All the way across Missouri and Kansas to this porch, and this man and this life that was taking shape around her like a house being built from the inside out. "There's one up there," she said, tilting her head back to look at the sky. "Your mother named them wrong. Mine named the clouds wrong. I think we should name this one something." His arms tightened around her. "What would you name it?" she considered. "Kate," she said. "I'd name it after my sister." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him press a kiss against the top of her head. "That's a good name," he said. "It suits it." She agreed. She thought it suited a great many things. Spring came to the AA with the usual violent beauty of Kansas springs, sudden and assertive, green replacing brown almost overnight, the creek running high with snowmelt, and the pastures full of new calves, and the cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves. Kate planted a kitchen garden in the patch behind the house, properly this time, with the intention of a woman who was not going anywhere. And she planted it with onions and beans and 2 kinds of tomato and a row of sunflowers along the south edge, because she had always wanted sunflowers and had never had the permanence to justify planting something that took a full season to bloom. She was not yet certain in March, and then in April she was certain, and she told Clayton on an evening in mid-April when they were sitting by the kitchen stove after supper. The hands retired to the bunkhouse, George gone to bed, the house quiet and theirs. He was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he took both her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the steady calm, not the careful warmth, something more naked and more enormous than either, something that had no calibration to it at all. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was the right thing. "Very well," she said. "Tired, but well." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed them there for a long moment without speaking, and she felt the warmth of it, the solidity of it, the specific texture of a man overcome by something and choosing to hold it quietly rather than perform it, and she thought that she understood why she had stopped planning to leave. George received the news at breakfast the following morning with such visible delight that he knocked his coffee cup over and didn't appear to notice. And Kate righted it without comment and refilled it, and he thanked her in a voice that was slightly unsteady, and then excused himself to go check on a fence he had already checked that morning. The Marsh brothers, when told, responded with the understated warmth she had come to expect from them. Eli said that was good news, and Thomas clapped Clayton on the shoulder hard enough to move him sideways a full step. And Helen Marsh arrived the following Sunday with a quantity of soft cotton flannel and instructions for its use and opinions about everything, all of which were delivered with such affectionate authority that Kate found herself nodding along and even contributing, which was not something she had expected from herself on the subject of domestic preparations. The baby came in late November of 1879, a boy, as it happened, born on a cold night with the wind up and Clayton pacing the kitchen below with the particular focused anxiety of a man who is very capable in emergencies and deeply unhappy about not being able to do anything useful in this one. The doctor from Caldwell came out, and the whole business was managed safely and well. And when it was over and Kate was propped up in the big bed with the baby wrapped in the cotton flannel Helen had brought, and Clayton was allowed upstairs, he stood in the doorway of their room for a moment before he came in, looking at her. She looked back at him. She was tired in a way she had never been tired before, a bone-deep cellular exhaustion, but she was also suffused with something so large and warm that there was no room left for anything complicated. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby, their son, solid and red-faced and extraordinarily opinionated about existing, into his arms, and she watched Clayton Atkins hold his son for the first time and felt something in her chest that was too large for the room. "He's extraordinary," Clayton said quietly. He sounded completely undone. "He's 7 pounds of fury is what he is," Kate said. "He is loudly displeased about everything." "He has opinions," Clayton said. "I respect that." "He has your eyes," she said, because he did already that particular shade of creekwater gray-green. "And your jaw," Clayton said. "He's going to be very stubborn." "Between the two of us that was inevitable," she agreed. They named him Thomas George Atkins Thomas for Thomas Marsh, who had been steadfast from the beginning, and George for his grandfather, who was going to be insufferably delighted about it. George Atkins, when told the middle name, did in fact have to sit down, and he sat there quietly for a long time with his hands folded and his eyes bright, and Kate thought that wherever her real parents had failed her, she had found, in this unexpected place, something that resembled family in every way that mattered. The first year of Thomas's life arranged itself around him with the natural reorganization that babies impose on households. He was a vigorous, noisy, curious child, constantly moving, constantly engaged, pulling himself upright against furniture at 8 months, and taking his first lurching steps at 10, to the tremendous excitement of the entire ranch. The hands took a collective pride in him that was partly genuine and partly territorial, as if a child born to the AA belonged to all of them in some peripheral sense. And Eli Marsh in particular took to riding Thomas around the yard on his horse, starting when the boy was old enough to sit upright, a practice that alarmed Kate and delighted Thomas to the point of shrieking happiness. Clayton was a father in the same way he was everything else, fully present, paying complete attention, doing whatever the situation called for without performance. He walked Thomas at 2 in the morning without complaint when the baby was in one of his disagreeable phases, and he saddled up Clara and rode Thomas through the east pasture to calm him when walking didn't work, and he sat on the kitchen floor and made entirely undignified sounds to produce Thomas's laugh, which was enormous and gurgling and worth any indignity. He was also, Kate observed with private warmth, completely unguarded with Thomas in a way he was unguarded nowhere else in the world, not even entirely with her, though he was more open with her than he was with anyone. With Thomas, he had no calibration at all. He was simply himself, completely and without reserve, and watching it was one of the more moving things she had witnessed in her life. The spring of 1881 brought a letter, a real one this time, not a threat but an inquiry from a woman in St. Louis. It was from a woman who signed herself as Margaret Collier, née Feeney, and who said she was Kate's. She used the name Kate, which meant she had been given the name through some channel Kate did not know distant cousin on the family's maternal side. She had heard through the Women's Placement Agency in Wichita. Apparently they passed on information, or some of it, with more latitude than Kate had realized that Nora Feeney had come west and settled in Kansas, and she wanted only to know if she was well. Kate sat with the letter for 3 days before she answered it. She wrote back under her own name, Kate Donnelly Atkins, and said that she was well, very well, that she was married to a cattle rancher in Caldwell, Kansas, and that she had a son who was 14 months old and had inherited the family stubbornness in full measure. She said that she hoped the same for Margaret Collier. She did not say much more than that because the past was the past and she had no desire to excavate more of it than she absolutely had to, but she said those things honestly, and she felt, when she sealed the envelope, that she had closed something that had been standing open since she left St. Louis. She showed the letter to Clayton that evening, the original and the copy of her reply both. He read them in silence and handed them back. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Strange," she said, "and all right." "Both at once." "That seems right," he said. She looked at the sealed envelope in her hand. "I think that's the last of it," she said. "The last open door. Malone is paid. The Missouri matter is closed. I've answered the cousin. I think," she paused, finding the words for something she had not yet tried to articulate. "I think I'm finished with the past. I don't mean I'll forget it. I mean I've finished going back to it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the firelight. "And forward, she said, "is where I want to be." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, very gently, the way he touched her when he was feeling something he didn't have immediate words for. "Me too," he said. She mailed the letter the following morning and watched it go with the post rider, and felt the past release her in some final, important way, like a knot untied, like a hand let go. She stood on the boardwalk in Caldwell for a moment in the April sunlight, and felt the weight she had been carrying shift and settle into something she could actually live with, which is different from the weight being gone, but is in some ways better, the difference between a burden and a history, between something that crushes you and something that is simply part of who you are. Kate Donnelly Atkins turned around and walked back down the boardwalk toward where she had tied Clara at the rail, and she rode home to the AA in the spring sunshine. And when she came into the yard, Thomas came barreling out of the house on his unsteady toddler legs, making a noise that was approximately her name. He was still working on the finer points of language. And she dismounted and gathered him up and held him against her shoulder, his solid warm weight, his hands in her hair, his voice going along in his cheerful, continuous, incomprehensible commentary about everything. Clayton appeared on the porch, leaning against the post with his arms folded, watching them with that expression she knew now, the one that meant he was simply looking at something he was grateful for. The summer of 1881 was hot and long and full. Thomas discovered the chicken yard and developed a passionate opinion about the chickens that the chickens did not entirely reciprocate. George Atkins taught his grandson to identify 6 different types of grass by feel, which Thomas was too young to fully appreciate, but which he submitted to with the particular focused patience he seemed to have inherited from his father. Eli Marsh's younger brother arrived from Missouri looking for work and proved as steady and capable as Eli, and Kate fed him for 3 months before it became apparent he intended to stay, at which point she simply added him to the household account without comment. She and Helen Marsh became genuine friends over that summer in the way 2 women become friends when they have worked alongside each other long enough. Bluntly, practically, with very little sentiment and a great deal of honesty. Helen told her things about Caldwell and the surrounding territory that she needed to know, and Kate told Helen things about the household management of the AA that made Helen's own operation more efficient, and they traded information and opinions over the fence between their properties with the frank directness of women who respected each other. She began, toward the end of that summer, to notice something that she had been trying not to notice. She was expecting again. She told Clayton on a Sunday afternoon ride, on the rise where you could see 20 miles of Kansas in every direction on a clear day. She said it plainly and watched his face. He looked at the horizon for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Thomas is going to be absolutely terrible about this," he said, with a warmth in his voice that made terrible sound like the best possible thing. "He is going to be impossible," she agreed. "He doesn't currently share anything with anyone. He shared my boot last week with a grasshopper he was particularly attached to," Clayton said. "That's different," Kate said. "Grasshoppers don't compete for attention." Clayton reached over from his horse and put his hand on hers on the reins, briefly, warm and certain. "A sibling will be good for him," he said. "He needs someone who will argue back." "All the chickens argue back," Kate said. "Someone who can match him in the long term," Clayton amended. She looked at the Kansas horizon, the long, flat, infinite reach of it, gold-brown in the late summer light. A sky so large it made everything under it feel simultaneously small and entirely significant. She thought about her sister, the real Kate, who had been a companion and an argument and a comfort all at once. She thought about her son on the kitchen floor with his grasshopper, his enormous laughing voice, his father's eyes. She thought about the east pasture window and the porch in the blue dusk and the rain-loud kitchen and the December church and all the particular accumulated moments that had built this life she was now living in. "We're going to need another bedroom," she said. "I've already thought about it," he said. "There's space on the south side of the house." "You've already thought about it," she repeated. "I've been thinking about it since April," he said with perfect composure. "I had a feeling." She stared at him. "How did you have a feeling in April?" "You planted sunflowers," he said. "More than you needed. You plant according to how permanent you feel, I've noticed. In March it was just beans. In April you added the sunflowers." She was so startled by this, by the precision of it, the quiet observational care of it, that she laughed, a genuine full laugh that scattered across the open Kansas plain in the afternoon light. He grinned at her. The real grin, the unguarded one, the one that rearranged his face into something almost boyish. "You have been watching me garden," she said. "I watch you do everything," he said simply. "You're interesting." She shook her head, still smiling. "We'll need more than one extra bedroom eventually," she said. "Eventually," he agreed. "I have plans." "Of course you do," she said fondly. The second child came in the spring of 1882. A girl this time, in better weather and better circumstances than Thomas's winter arrival. She was born on an April morning when the creek was running high, and the cottonwoods were putting out their pale new leaves, and she was small and alert, and from the first hour of her life appeared to have a great many opinions about everything she encountered, which suggested she had inherited the appropriate quantities of stubbornness from both sides. They named her Clara Kate Atkins, Clara for the gentle bay mare who had carried her mother across the Kansas plain through so many Sunday afternoons of slowly becoming someone new, and Kate for the sister whose name had been both refuge and gift, whose memory Kate Donnelly Atkins carried with her everywhere she went and would carry always. Thomas, who had been prepared for this event with some care by both his parents and his grandfather and the Marsh brothers collectively, and who had been told repeatedly that the baby was coming and that it was good news, considered his sister for approximately 20 minutes before declaring, with the authority of a 2-year-old, that she was acceptable. George Atkins held Clara Kate the morning after she was born and looked down at her with an expression that Kate watched from the bed and thought was perhaps the most complete expression of happiness she had ever seen on a human face, unguarded and enormous and entirely without self-consciousness. An old man holding his granddaughter in the morning light of a Kansas April, grateful for everything. "She looks like her mother," he said. "She looks like herself," Kate said. "She just got here. Give her time." "She looks like herself then," George agreed, with the gentle accuracy of a man who has never minded being corrected, and she is magnificent. The south room addition to the house was completed by summer. Clayton had built it himself, with the help of the hands and Thomas Marsh, who turned out to have genuine carpentry skills that had never come up in conversation before. It had 2 new bedrooms and a wider kitchen window that Kate had specifically requested, because the old one let in insufficient light, and Clayton had made it 18 inches wider than she asked for because he said she was probably underestimating how much light she actually needed, which she privately acknowledged was accurate. The fall of 1882 brought a change to Caldwell that changed the whole territory by degrees. The cattle drives on the Kisham Trail were beginning to slow, the railroads were moving, the ranges were being fenced, the open trail that had been the living heart of this part of Kansas for 15 years was shutting down incrementally, push by push, wire by wire. It was a change that men discussed in the saloons and around the cattle brokers' tables with the worried gravity of people watching a season end, and it was real enough. The world was changing, closing in, becoming something different from what it had been when Clayton's father had first built the AA on the Kansas plain. Clayton navigated it the way he navigated most things, with a considered pragmatism that did not minimize the difficulty, but also did not catastrophize it. He talked with Kate about it in the evenings, and she was glad he did, glad that he treated these conversations as genuinely shared rather than as matters of business that would bore her or that she wouldn't understand. She had opinions, and he listened to them, and some of them he incorporated into his thinking, and some of them he pushed back on, and they argued about it sometimes with real friction and always resolved it, which was the thing she had found most surprising and most valuable about their marriage, that they could disagree genuinely and be all right after. He diversified as the cattle trade shifted. He brought in horses, working horses for the new ranches going in north and west as more settlers arrived, and the AA adapted. It was not without hardship, not without lean seasons, but it held. George Atkins's health began to slow in the winter of 1883. Nothing dramatic. He remained cheerful and engaged and present, still teaching Thomas to identify grasses by feel, and now telling Kate elaborate stories about the stars with names he mostly invented. But he tired more easily than he had, and Kate noticed him moving more carefully, with the measured attention to his own body that people develop when they become aware of its limitations. She watched over him with the matter-of-fact, affectionate efficiency that had become her way with people she loved, making sure he ate properly, making sure his room was warm enough, making sure someone rode with him to town rather than letting him go alone. He knew what she was doing, and he let her do it without comment, which was his form of gratitude. In the spring of 1884, Thomas George Atkins turned 4 years old and began demanding daily riding lessons, with a persistence that suggested he had in fact inherited everyone's stubbornness simultaneously. Clayton put him on a small, steady pinto mare named Biscuit and gave him his first proper lesson on a Saturday morning, and Kate stood at the corral fence and watched her son sit upright on a horse for the first time with the particular posture that was entirely his father's, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too multidirectional to fully name, pride and love and grief for things past and gratitude for things present, all braided together into something that was just her life, this specific irreplaceable life she had found by accident and had chosen to keep. Kate, who was 2 and deeply interested in everything her brother did and deeply committed to doing all of it immediately and without assistance, stood next to her mother at the corral fence and watched with an expression of focused intention that made Kate think they were going to need another small, steady mare sooner than anticipated. George joined them at the fence after a few minutes, moving slowly with the careful dignity that had become his way, and stood between his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter and watched Clayton walk Thomas around the corral on Biscuit, and he put one hand on Kate's arm briefly, not much, just a touch, and said, "I want you to know, Kate, that my son chose very, very well." She put her hand over his. "So did I," she said. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that has seen enough of life to be genuine about the good of it. George Atkins died peacefully in the autumn of 1884 in his own bed, with Clayton sitting beside him. He had had a good day the day before. He had played on the kitchen floor with Thomas for an hour, which Thomas narrated for both of them, and which had apparently involved a complex negotiation between two wooden horses and a tin cup. And he had told Kate over supper that the AA was the best thing he had ever built, and he was glad it would stay in good hands. She grieved him honestly and well. Not with the collapsed, helpless grief she had spent years being terrified of, but with the solid, functioning grief of someone who knew how to carry weight and had people around her helping to carry it. Clayton was steady and sad in the way he was everything completely, without performance. Thomas did not entirely understand what had happened, but understood that it was serious and was accordingly solemn in his 4-year-old way. Kate, who was too small to understand the full shape of death, understood that her grandfather was gone and sat in her mother's lap a great deal that week and patted Kate's arm with her small hand, which was both heartbreaking and deeply comforting. They buried him on the AA, on the rise where you could see 20 miles of Kansas in every direction on a clear day, which seemed right. The years after George's passing settled into the deep groove of a life that had found its shape and was living fully inside it. Caldwell changed around them. The cattle drives were effectively finished by 1885, and the town reinvented itself with the slightly uncertain energy of a place looking for new purpose, some of which it found and some of which it didn't. The AA, with its horse operation and its adaptations, held steady. Not wealthy, not precarious, solid, the way ground is solid when it's been properly tended. Thomas grew into himself with an energy that was exhausting and delightful in equal measure, talkative, curious, with his father's eyes, and what Kate recognized as her own stubbornness fully developed, plus a gift for talking to horses that Clayton said was unprecedented in the Atkins family, and Kate said was the Feeney blood expressing itself. He was generous with his sister in the ways that mattered and infuriating in the ways that didn't, which seemed about right for siblings. Kate, as she grew, revealed herself to be quiet where her brother was loud and precise where he was sprawling, with a mind that worked in the particular careful way of someone who looks at something from several directions before deciding what she thinks about it. She was her grandfather's student before George died. She had inherited the star-naming habit, which she executed with strict and private seriousness, and she became afterward her father's shadow in the corral, developing a relationship with horses that matched her brother's, and if anything, exceeded it in depth. Kate watched them both grow with the ongoing wonder of a woman who had not expected to have this. Not as a philosophical statement, but as a literal, specific truth. She had not expected this house, this land, these children, this man, this life. She had come to Caldwell with a dead woman's name and a living woman's desperation, and she had found, in a hardware store and on a porch in the blue dusk, and in a rain-loud kitchen, and in all the subsequent years, something she had not allowed herself to want for a very long time. She was 30 years old in 1885, and she knew herself, and she knew where she was and why it was good. She and Clayton had settled into the particular profound intimacy of a marriage that has gone through enough together to stop being effortful, not complacent, nothing so flat as that, but comfortable in the way of something load-bearing, reliable and solid and deeply warm. He still brought her wildflowers from the creek bank when he happened past them. She still made the coffee exactly the way he liked it, and he never took that for granted. They still talked in the evenings, and still sometimes disagreed with genuine friction, and still always resolved it. He still looked at her in a way that she never tired of, the full, complete attention, as if there was nothing else in the room worth looking at. One evening in the spring of 1886, they sat on the porch together in the blue dusk. Their porch now, in every sense, as thoroughly theirs as the land and the creek and the cottonwood trees and the east pasture where she had first looked out a window and felt something that bordered on hope. Thomas was in the barn doing his evening chores with the particular 7-year-old version of doing chores, which involved a great deal of commentary and negotiation. Kate was inside at the kitchen table drawing something with the stump of a pencil, very serious. The sky was doing the thing it does over Kansas in spring evenings, turning shades of orange and gold, and a particular deep rose along the horizon that no other sky quite replicates, as if the plain is too large and too flat for the light to go anywhere else, and it simply accumulates there, resting before it becomes dark. "I think," Kate said, watching the light, "that my sister would have liked it here." Clayton was leaning back in his chair beside her. He looked at the sky and then at her. "Tell me something about her," he said. "Something I don't know yet." She thought about it. She had told him many things about her sister over 8 years of marriage, and she went through the catalog and found something she hadn't told him yet. She was afraid of horses, she said. Deeply afraid. She would never admit it. She would stand very close to one and pet its nose with enormous bravery and then go around the back of the house and shake for 10 minutes after. She smiled at the memory. She was the bravest person I've ever known, and she was terrified of horses. She never let anyone make it into something small. Clayton was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She sounds like someone who would have been worth knowing." "She was worth everything," Kate said. "You carry her well," he said. "Her name and all of it. I've thought so for a long time." She looked at him. "Thank you for saying that. I mean it." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and folded her fingers in his. "Thank you for being here. I know it wasn't simple. I know what it cost to stay." She turned her hand over and held his back. "It stopped costing," she said. "A while ago, it just became being here." "Yes," he said. The light went from gold to rose to the deep blue of true dusk, and the first stars came out over the Kansas plain, and Thomas came in from the barn making a great deal of noise about something the horses had done, and Kate's voice came from inside asking a question in the careful way of someone who actually wants the answer. The creek was audible in the quiet between the sounds, the way it always was in spring, high and clear. Kate Donnelly Atkins, Nora Feeney, who had become Kate by love and by loss and by necessity, and by the particular grace of a man who had looked at her true self and found it worth loving without reservation, sat on her porch in the spring dusk and held her husband's hand and watched the stars come out over the land they had built a life on. She had worn her dead sister's name into a new life. She had carried it like a stone sewn into a coat lining heavy and constant for 2 years of running, and then she had arrived somewhere worth stopping, and the stone had become something different. Not weightless. You don't get weightless, not really, not if you've actually lived. But something different from a burden. A foundation, maybe. Something you stand on rather than something that holds you down. She thought of the porch 8 years ago, the first conversation, the stars and the wrong names her sister had given the clouds. She thought of the hardware store and the honest answer to an honest question. She thought of the rain-loud kitchen and the December church and the 2 children currently making noise at various distances from where she sat. She thought that her sister would have liked this very much, the horses aside. "I'm happy," she said aloud. She said it plainly and directly, the way she said everything now, with none of the old caution. "I want to say that out loud because I spent a long time not being able to say it and I don't want to take it for granted." Clayton looked at her, creekwater eyes in the dusk light, his real face the unguarded one, the one she knew best of any face in the world. "So am I," he said. "I want to say that out loud too." Thomas arrived on the porch at a run to report an important development involving one of the barn cats, which turned out to be that she had kittens. And this was the most significant event in Thomas George Atkins's 7 years on Earth. Kate appeared in the doorway behind him, having abandoned her pencil drawing for the barn cat news, and Clayton and Kate were pulled from their chairs and toward the barn by two small, urgent people, and the spring evening continued around them, ordinary and complete, the stars coming out one by one over the dark Kansas plain, while the family of the AA went to look at kittens. Inside, on the kitchen table, Clara Kate's pencil drawing was visible in the lamplight through the kitchen window, a row of rough shapes along a horizon line that was probably meant to be the fence, and above them, a scattering of round dots that were certainly stars. Under the stars, in the careful labored printing of a 4-year-old learning her letters, a single word: home. She had spelled it correctly. The life that continued on the AA through the last years of the 1880s was a full one in the richest sense, not without hardship, not without the ordinary friction of a working ranch in a changing territory, not without the grief and the difficulty that are part of any life honestly lived, but full in the specific sense of a life populated with meaning. The children growing and arguing and learning and becoming themselves, the ranch adapting and holding, the evenings on the porch and the mornings at the kitchen table, and the Sunday afternoon rides across the land that was theirs in every way that land can be said to belong to people who have loved it. And at the center of all of it, constant as the creek and as solid as the land under it, was what Kate Donnelly Atkins and Clayton Atkins had built together. Not perfectly, not easily, not without the hard work that any real thing requires, but genuinely with their whole selves, in the particular way that two people build something together when they have both been honest about who they are and found each other worthy of that honesty. She had come to Caldwell with a dead woman's name and a living woman's fear, and no particular expectation of any of this. The man who had loved her had loved all of it, the name and the fear and the real woman underneath them both without condition or reservation, which is the only way that kind of love works. The sunflowers came up every summer along the south edge of the kitchen garden, reliable as the season, planted by a woman who had decided once, many years ago, to put down roots in a place where things could actually grow. And they did grow. Year after year, tall and certain, turning their faces toward the Kansas sun with the particular stubborn persistence of things that have found where they belong.